Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today we have Professor Dr. Wenyuan Wu. She previously was the director of the administration at the Asian American Coalition for Education and is currently the executive director of Californians for Equal Rights. And we've got a lot to talk about the work that she's been doing here in the United States around issues of education, around issues of critical race theory and critical social justice. But before we get to all that, the first question is always, what did we bring to this conversation? Wenyuan, what did you bring to drink?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. Just a small correction. I am not a professor. I wish I was. This is what I'm drinking right now. I am holding up a can of Croix Pamplemousse flavored soda. And this is a great sign of my successful assimilation into America's mainstream culture.
Yes, it is.
David, do you have anything?
I do. You know, I've embarrassed myself with what I've been drinking so many times on this podcast that, like, why stop now? So I actually must admit, I went through the MacDonald's drive-thru to get a large Diet Coke this morning because it's 99 cents. So anyway, that's what I'm drinking.
Maybe I can reach out to MacDonald's and see if they'll give us a little bit of, plug for this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I knew it meant something.
Well, I am drinking I'm doing something new, a spiked lemonade. So there you have it. And before we get started, Wenyuan, I want to apologize. I know you're Dr. Wu, and so I just automatically said professor, so my bad. Thank you for the correction. You worked very hard to be Dr. Wu. And actually let me start there, because we have a lot in common. You are your PhD is in international studies, and that's what my degree is in as well, and got some degrees from Johns Hopkins University, but also Nanjing University. So that's where we're connected. And here's my question to you. I've been seeing so much discussion around critical race theory and its infiltration into our education system. I know that this is something that's very important to you and something that you're working on very closely. And here's something I have observed, and I'd love to get your feedback, and we'll start here. A lot of people, particularly in California, that I noticed that are very much against this, and also against Prop 16, which we'll get into, and I'd love for you to explain, are a lot of Asian Americans. And I think that I see a strong coalition of Asian Americans who have, education is so important in the Asian American community in general. I'm stereotyping in general, but I've seen such a strength in numbers from the Asian community around issues of critical race theory in the schools. And I'd love for you to speak to that and why it's important to you personally, Dr. Wu, and then maybe why it's important specifically to the Asian community, and then in general as well.
Wow. Okay, those are a lot of important and loaded questions. So let me start with my personal motivations in working against critical race theory. It's not just in its academic nitty-gritty, but against its real life implications. So as you mentioned, my intellectual background is in international studies. Like you, I studied political science, international relations, and political economy, as the three common tracks of international studies in my graduate studies. And as a graduate teaching assistant, I used to teach critical race theory as a class for advanced political science students and master students in international studies as a sub-school of thought which is a hodgepodge of neo-Marxism, radical feminism, constructivism, and the Frankfurt School of Thought, as well as postmodernism. So it's a rather political and contested theory that examines all our social relations, the economic governance of our society and our political institutions through a race-based point of view, or through the prism of race. And I find that theoretical origin to be at least an imperfect explanation of our society in both our history and our present. And it's, I would call this bankrupt ideology, a bankrupt theory of thought that misguides our public discourse and our national conversations on race, racism, and how to go forward beyond our past historical shackles of racism. So that's my personal motivation, which is to stop critical race theory and keep it where it belongs, which is its academic monkey cage. And and unfortunately, we are seeing an aggressive trend of this dogma informing our public discussions, informing our policies and programs, from education to workplaces to local governance to even national governance. So that's the dangerous part. And I think that this practical ground is the reason why this theory and its implementation have generated so much public opposition. So now I always consider myself first and foremost an individual, an American, and then one of Asian descent or of Chinese descent. So I always put a disclaimer whenever we venture into this topic on the Asian American community and our recent civil rights journey for equal rights and equal education rights. I always put out this disclaimer that I cannot speak on behalf of the whole community, which is not a monolith, as the other side would always say when it serves them, right? But I can try to make some logical inference and explanations based on my experience engaging the community, especially the community in California. So last year, as you may have read about in the news, the California legislature pushed out a ballot measure called Proposition 16 onto the November state general election, and the proposition was a simple repeal of the California Constitution, Article 1, Section 31A, which says the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public education, public employment, and public contracting. So Proposition 16 intended to repeal these very simple and elegant 37 words, which is the basis of California's constitutional principle of equal treatment, and it was passed into law by Prop 209 back in 1996. So I was honored and privileged to be called to lead a campaign against Proposition 16, which was later known as the No on 16 campaign. We did a brilliant campaign. We were outspent by a factor of 16-1. So the other side raised over $31 million. We raised a little over $1.7 million, mostly from small grassroots donors with a big majority coming from the Chinese American community in California. I think that Asian Americans have, since the early 1990s, really fought to preserve the true notion of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and as well as the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to safeguard equal education rights for all American students, regardless of race. And it just happens to be the Asian American students in the present political and social contexts who have been discriminated against disproportionately by both Ivy League institutions, the selective colleges, and K-12 gifted and talented programs throughout the country. So the galvanizing of the Asian American community nationwide and in California last year to reject the notion of racial preferences or preferential treatment is built upon a reaction to ongoing systematic discrimination in education against high-performing Asian American students. But more importantly, I would say that we are fighting not only for our interests, we are fighting more importantly for this principal issue, for what we think should constitute the American ideal or the American dream. And in this sense, Asian Americans emphasize on education, in my opinion, is nothing Asian, is nothing unique. It is very much in line with our founding principles of equality, of merit, and liberty. So in this way, we're very proud to have fought on the forefront of recent battles, such as No on 16, such as a similar battle in Washington State in 2019 against Referendum 88, and fights against Harvard University, Yale, Princeton, and others on anti-Asian discrimination. But at the bottom line is that we're fighting for the same thing. We're fighting for the same thing, which is equal citizenship, equal access, and true equality. And I think on this basis, we have been able to build a truly diverse and broad-based coalition last year against Prop 16 in California, which went down by 57.2% of the electorate. Over 9.72 million Californians voted against racial preferences, and that's in America's most populated and most progressive state. So that's impressive. But we're also seeing a continuation of such organic coalition building from electoral matters such as Prop 16 to this broader cultural battle against critical race theory. So in Texas, for example, in where you are in Austin, Texas, right? In South Lake, I think it was last month, two candidates for the South Lake School Board won the election on anti-CRT or anti-critical race theory platforms. And that's a district which went overwhelmingly for Biden last year. So I would also argue that this coalition, this alliance is truly bipartisan in nature.
I've got you were absolutely right to say, and there is no monolith, and we all can only speak for each other. So thank you for saying that, because I so appreciate that so much. That said, I'm still going to generalize a little bit. Forgive me for that, because I do recognize all of our individuality. But what I see as someone who's studied, lived, worked in China is, there's what's so fascinating to me is what I do see in a lot, not all, a lot of Asian Americans, and particularly for me that I'm connected with Chinese Americans, is there is this sense of fighting for exactly what you said. I mean, the immigration to America was for the ideals that you mentioned: liberty, equality, freedom. And so I see that playing out now in these fights that you just mentioned, whether it's the CRT in school, Prop 16. Would you agree that, in general, a lot of people, immigrants in general, a lot of immigrants who come here to America come for certain values that they want to see play out. And when I think that when they don't see it playing out, then there's that impetus like to act, and maybe even more so sometimes than a someone who is born and raised in America, because they almost take it for granted. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I agree with this impetus of almost a visceral rush to safeguard and promote what we believing as the pull factors that have attracted us to come here, to put our roots down here. And I think I'm very proud of a lot of the volunteers and community leaders that I've worked with in the last 3 to 4 years from the Asian community, who are predominantly first generation immigrants. And I do see this common theme of standing up, showing up, and fighting for what we believe as true American values. And I always make this argument that we're not less American just because we have different national origins, or we don't speak English as our first language. But what we're fighting for here is a common good. And I would also extend the argument by saying that most Americans, whether they're Americans by birth or by choice, are motivated by this common sense of protecting our liberal values. Essentially, when we look at what our founding principles are, we are conserving the fruits of a radical liberal revolution, right? And I think that's these values have facilitated our nation's success and prosperity and global competitiveness for too long. And sometimes we can lose sight, of petty divisions and petty infighting, and we as a society can rush to this pessimist view of our country and of our history as depicted by critical race theory. It's always easier to avoid real questions about why we have racial inequalities, why we have the social ills that are not escaped by a democracy, and why we don't have the achievements of these lofty goals of our founding fathers. But I can tell you that critical race theory, or to examine our past and present through the lenses of race, is not the answer. The medicine is worse than the disease.
So we have a new concept, not so new, but it's a concept that's been revamped, called equity, that has been popularized, I'm sure you are well aware, by Ibram X. Kendi. I know that some of the ideas you've already touched on are really referred to that concept, but I want to take it a step further. One possible problem with the equity concept, I'm Jewish, by the way, so we are also part of a community that might be on the losing end of this new concept. One idea is that if it is the case that people only are left behind because of discrimination, because of white supremacy, then the only way they're getting ahead is because of white supremacy. And that would then implicate Asian Americans, it would implicate Jewish Americans, it would implicate all the communities that are proportionally represented in certain workspaces and universities and the like. And that seems to be a dangerous label, to say that you've been complicit in white supremacy so that you could get ahead. You're white adjacent is another term we've heard frequently.
Yeah.
What is your take on that? Are you concerned that it's not only going to be used against you in terms of numbers? In other words, because more people who are less qualified get into the university or into the workplace, you will be a natural casualty of that because of the numbers game, but you might be specifically targeted because you're overrepresented in the numbers. What is your take on that?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that equity has become an amorphous code name for critical race theory in practice. So when we look at the dictionary definition of equity, it literally means justice and fairness, and by natural law. But we as modern society have really sort of hijacked the term to mean equal outcomes. And that carries a lot of political connotations as well as unintended consequences, right? And you mentioned Ibram Kendi. So he has this famous quote, which I think really represents the illiberal part of critical race theory and anti-racism. He says, and I quote, "The defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist." Quote ends. So basically, according to Ibram Kendi and other critical race theory proponents, equity becomes an overarching societal goal when we look at our educational policies in terms of admissions in higher education and also in K-12 education nowadays, as well as policies in the workplaces and in governance, right? So I think it's very dangerous. It's playing with fire because we're putting a word that has little substance without further elaboration into. We're giving it so much meaning and cadence that we miss the unintended consequences and the feedback loops as a result of engaging in racial equity in all our aspects of our public life. So in education, for example, you mentioned this concept of overrepresentation versus underrepresentation. I think that notion is political in nature, and it's unhelpful in one for two reasons. One, it creates unduly burdens and discrimination against the so-called overrepresented student groups. So in this case, it's Asian American students nowadays and Jewish students about a century ago, right? And it dismisses the individual agency and within group differences of this so-called overrepresented student group, but it's also a politically disfavored group. And if you tell me that a student whose parents toil in ethnic enclaves in Chinatown in New York, who is not privileged in any way, needs to give his or her admission slot into a prestigious educational institution to accommodate racial equity, I would tell you that it's ridiculous. It's unfair. So it betrays the natural definition of equity. And I would also say that any attempt to make a specific institution entirely representative of our general population will always founder on the sheer complexity of American demographics and the nature of the institution itself. So and number two, I think engaging or being obsessed with this prescription of overrepresentation versus underrepresentation also hurts the so-called underrepresented student groups. Right. Go ahead.
So I wanna dig a little deeper into CRT. You were a bit critical. I think you said it's been it's been bankrupt ideology, and yet if one actually looks at critical race theory, I would argue it has two basic propositions. One is that there is bias that's embedded in systems of society, and two, that the people adversely affected by those biased systems are more likely to understand, see it, and be able to define it than the dominant culture. Now, it seems, though, that in some ways, when you're talking about the Asian Americans being a politically disfavored group, in a way, you're acknowledging an observation of critical race theory that there might be systemic bias against certain groups, including Asian Americans. And so I'm wondering if there's a third way to speak about critical race theory that doesn't either uphold it as a dogma, as we're seeing in schools, or dismiss it too easily because it's being used in the way that it's being used, but rather says it's a lens. It has a truth that might hold in certain contexts, but not other contexts. What do you think of that?
I would clarify here that I don't think critical race theory holds an explanation as to why Asian American students, for example, have been discriminated against, particularly in the area of seeking admissions into top universities and colleges. I don't think race or racism plays a part in that explanation. So if we go down the road prescribed by critical race theory, then systematic disadvantages or adverse outcomes are always a result of institutional disadvantages, and in many cases are a result of white supremacy, right, or racism. But I really think that this kind of sort of a fatalist and deterministic view of our social and political outcomes is inaccurate, because if we look at just the case of anti-Asian discrimination in education, I think a lot of these systematic practices can be traced back to policy failures that have failed to lift up underserved and under-resourced students and communities. And as a result, Asian American students become a scapegoat at the altar of racial equity to compensate for underrepresentation in the other communities. So I think that we really need to dig deeper at the policy level instead of the politics. And coming back to your question on how we can best utilize the analytical approach promoted by critical race theory, I really that number one, we need to keep critical race theory where it should belong, which is in ivory towers. It is a very abstract and interdisciplinary school of thought that should be studied by students with advanced knowledge in political science, in social studies, as well as students with a certain level of critical thinking and cognitive capacity. And it should not be propagated to a degree that it becomes a prevalent source of source of inspiration or an ideological foundation for practices involving children even in elementary schools, such as a case that I worked on late last year that involved a third grade math class in Cupertino, California, that in which the math teacher asked the students, third graders, to deconstruct their intersectional social identities. So I think that's when we really get into the danger zone as a result of promoting critical race theory in our public life.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I completely agree with that. That's absurd. Do you favor all such efforts to sort of ban CRT from K through 12?
It's a, and I'm sorry for the pause. Yes
No,
and
please.
no. Yes and no. I think that it's encouraging news to see lawmakers throughout the country at the state level and state legislatures taking up efforts to ban teaching of divisive concepts, ban race shaming, racial stereotyping, race essentialism in K-12. But there are a number of issues with this legislative, what I call legislative approach to take on critical race theory. Number one is the unnecessary politicization of the theory and its practice. Because when you look at the over a dozen states that have banned so-called critical race theory in K-12 classrooms, those are predominantly Republican dominated legislatures. So we run into this problem of the opposition against critical race theory being equated as a conservative crusade, but it is not. Even in the example that I just gave, South Lake, Texas, it was a truly broad-based effort that took down that helped these two school board candidates gain their positions in a very progressive school district. So I think that the coalition needs to move beyond the conservative base, and that's the only way that we can win.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Number two, I'll ask in a minute.
and number two, it's really about the implementation of these bans. How do we enforce these legislative rules in individual school districts and individual schools when teachers who have been indoctrinated themselves on critical race theory are hell-bent on teaching systemic racism, racial justice, anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion as the center of their educational and pedagogical approaches? How do we truly root these practices out? I don't think the legislature approach is the answer. I think that we need to look more into the ground game, in our local communities and school districts, as well as in what can shape and reorient our culture. So at the end of the day, the goal is always to change the hearts and the minds of people so that they can see beyond the lies, the dishonesty, and trickery of this doctrine. And so the goal, in other words, is always to raise public awareness rather than to challenge the practices in legislatures or in courts.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think you're absolutely right, because you can legislate all day long, and if the hearts and minds of our teachers and educators say a different thing, that's not going to have an impact. I wanted to not really changing gears. It was based on what you said a little bit earlier, though. The politicization, I'm tongue-tied today, of this issue. I don't know how to get beyond it being politicized. It very much disturbs me how politicized it has become. But here's what's interesting to me. to the extent that, and we'll talk politics for a minute, although that's not really the purpose, but to the extent that we saw the number of second generation Americans voting for Donald Trump, I don't think it was because they were necessarily turning conservative per se, but I honestly think that a lot of that is because of this narrative, critical race theory and the narrative of critical social justice, where people were saying this doesn't speak to me. And it has become politicized because it has become where it is, more the Democratic Party that uses that language. And you saw the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, who was fighting against it. And I honestly think, to the extent, and I could be totally wrong, this is a guess, but I honestly think to the extent that we saw a lot of second generation Americans put their vote in for Trump, it was because almost exclusively, I would argue, don't have the facts in my mind, because of that issue.
Yeah, that's a highly plausible hypothesis.
Hypothesis, right?
Yeah, and I think in embracing critical race theory, in embracing this a political agenda of racial justice, I fear that the Democratic Party is really overreaching and is engaging in counterproductive political pandering to the American public. And in a way, I think that it's going to backfire, and it will also lead to a certain level of implosion within the party, because when we examine the basic tenets of critical race theory, we realize that critical race theory is essentially an illiberal doctrine, an illiberal school of thought. So fighting critical race theory then becomes an intensely moral issue that unites people of different political, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And if one of the two dominant political parties in the United States cannot decide on breaking freely, whether or not to break freely with this illiberal doctrine, it's going to cause some damages to the party.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that. Well, first of all, I'm concerned about our very rigid two-party system where you're kind of forced into one or the other, and it really does hinge on, like I just said, maybe one issue that flips you one way or the other. So there's that, and that's a whole different conversation. But you mentioned something, and I do see there is a growing fear that the current administration is exacerbating, perhaps, or promoting even, I guess, some of these dialogue, our national dialogue around race and critical race theory. That is, even as much as we've seen the pushback, which has been, what you're doing in California, no on Prop 6, what we saw in Texas and South Lake, we saw in Idaho recently. But then when you've got a national, at the federal level, dialogue around, the president said the other day, white supremacy is the biggest terrorist threat to our nation. I believe that's an exact quote.
Right. That may be true, by the way, and it still may be that ideologies on the left are a tremendous threat to our liberal society. In other words, those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? You could say that there are two different kinds of threats. There's a terrorist threat of white supremacy or white nationalism, and there's an ideological threat from the left that threatens to undermine our liberal society, and those both could be true.
Yeah, no,
I agree.
That's a great. I love that. But that's not what we're saying, at least at the federal level, at the national level. Yes, there's a white supremacy. Whenever you find it, is a problem.
Right.
But it's framed only as that, and that promotes this advocacy of critical race theory, particularly among a lot of people who don't really even understand critical race theory has become a slogan word at this point, which basically, and when you said this at the beginning, it pretty much equity and critical race theory have almost become synonymous. And I would say like white supremacy and critical race theory have almost become synonymous. So we've got a lot of these slogan words that have caught on that are being equated with critical race theory incorrectly.
Right. Before you answer, can I just give an alternative view of the Biden administration that I'm not sure I buy, by the way, but I just wanted to put it out there. Another interpretation would be that the Biden administration understands that it's in a very difficult dilemma with a vibrant left-wing, woke, if you will, group that's very loud, very prominent in the party, and maybe a larger, softer spoken Democratic Party that doesn't necessarily buy into these ideologies. And what it's trying to do is sort of advance sort of a soft form of critical social justice that sort of keeps that one constituency happy without doing too much to alienate its right flank. And it's doing the minimum to do so. Now, I'm not sure I believe that, but that is an alternative interpretation.
I tend to, I think I'm going to gravitate towards that alternative explanation that David just offered. And, I do think that there is this short-term political impulse to pander to the louder and more radical wing of the party by engaging in a full-on fight against white supremacy, against systemic racism. So, for example, the Education Department recently published grant funding priority for civic education and American history programs in K-12 education, in which the 1619 Project and Ibram X. Kendi's work are prioritized, are at least listed as references. So that's one example. And then another example, the CDC has recently listed systemic racism as a public health crisis. But I think that the problem in this sort of caving into this more radical faction of the Democratic Party is that it's dismissing the softer, less aggressive, yet not less in numbers faction, or the majority of the American public. So just look at the election in California last year. As I said, 57.2% of California voters, which included a large number of voters who went for Biden, went against racial preferences. What does that tell us? That tells us that upholding the true basic principles of equality and equal opportunity should be the single most poignant path for both political parties. And then yet, unfortunately, I have seen almost a stubborn unwillingness on the part of the federal government and the Democratic Party nowadays to move beyond these narrow partisan confines and truthfully engage with the dead bull's eye sensible center where the American majority live. And I fear that this mismatch between politics and true policy solutions is going to cost us dearly, not just in terms of partisan politics, but also in terms of our education system, our global competitiveness. So it becomes almost an existential struggle now to push back against critical race theory and the host of symptoms and practices informed by it.
Yeah.
Yes. All I can say is yes.
Yeah.
I think that it is an issue of global competition. If you start looking at it in science, for example, and if you have an equity orientation in science, and you have to quote a certain number of minority scientists, or you have to have your research done by a certain number of minority scientists, how is that going to keep us competitive with your country of origin, China? They're certainly not applying those standards to minority communities, and I think it becomes a huge problem for this country if we're not choosing, especially in certain professions like scientists, the very best that we have. And that means creating a pipeline of minorities from early age who are immersed in STEM and who have all the opportunities in the world to make up for perhaps past wrongs, and can rise up to the height of these professions. But until then, it has to be a meritocracy, in my view.
Right, and meritocracy is not in conflict with justice, with social justice in its truest form. So when we look at all these policy prescriptions promoted by critical race theory and its subvariants, right? We look at an urge to fix the finishing line, to fix the outcomes in whether it's in our education system or in our broader society. So it's counterproductive because it's not looking at the root problems behind issues such as the academic achievement gap, such as a persistent failures throughout K-12 education, especially impacting underserved communities. So if we truly want to lift up all American students, we need to look at solutions at the level of lower grades schools, at the level of communities, and at the level of families. But we're not looking at these sometimes painful solutions that would take maybe over a generation to achieve some positive results. So we engage in cheap politicking, and that's also a form of soft bigotry, right? Because we're insinuating that certain groups, certain minorities cannot succeed without extra help, without government sanctioned help or preferences.
I totally agree. And I think all of us here, I mean, gosh, Wenyuan, you even have an organization, that's focused on equal rights. So I mean, equal rights is what we're after. And I feel that the fear is that we are normalizing, though, through a lot of the discussions at higher levels, we're normalizing not equal rights, we're normalizing equity, which is what we discussed earlier. And I think that is regressive. That's regressive for equal rights. And like you said, I mean, it's kind of bringing us back where we're not creating the solutions that are going to bring us to that situation where we are and possess the equal rights that all of us here are fighting for.
It's fighting fire with fire.
You couldn't have said it better.
And when we look at civil rights, which I believe should be essentially and fundamentally individual rights, right? Civil rights are fundamentally individual rights of equal access and equal protection. And at a time when minority groups did not have, and I use the past tense here, did not have equal access and equal protection during a historical period of time, maybe civil rights were necessarily and practically and temporarily about group rights. But this conversation and normalization of equity and racial justice or social justice into our public policies and public discourse is dangerously perpetuating the temporary base of civil rights as group rights, and it's very dangerous. It's going to put us on a regressive and and discriminatory path, illiberal path, and I worry about that.
Man, that is so insightful. Well, Wenyuan, I'm almost done with my drink, so I've got my last question for you is, are you along this topic? What scares you the most, and what gives you the most hope?
Let me start with hope, because I'm scared about a lot of trends and movements in pertinent to the topics on our discussion today. But I'm more encouraged by a growing organic coalition or opposition against critical race theory, against racial grievance, against racial preferences, coming from ordinary Americans of every stripe. And I'm very encouraged by and grateful to the opportunity of knowing these ordinary people who may not look like me, who may not talk like me, but we agree on the very principles of what we want in our society and how we want this country to be for our children. So I'm encouraged by that, and I'm just concerned about this general trend by the political, economic, and social cultural elites of obsessing with race and racism, and I think with that obsession it comes a natural inclination to search for CRT infused solutions that are actually non-solutions. So I worry about that guiding our country into a dangerous journey. But more than my fears, I think I am very encouraged, and I'm very motivated by my fellow Americans.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you motivate us. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.